From whispering grasslands of Central Asia to the crowded streets of Europe, an invisible killer traveled the ancient trade routes. When Yersinia pestis found its path in flea and rat and human flesh, it remade the medieval world in its wake. Between 1347 and 1353, perhaps half of Europe perished. Doctors helpless, prayers unanswered, corpses piled in unhallowed pits. But what survived was transformation. Medicine born of desperation, social orders upended, faith questioned beneath church spires. The pestilence that devoured millions ultimately birthed modernity itself, proving that even history's darkest shadow cannot extinguish humanity's stubborn flame. The grasslands of Central Asia had always carried whispers. They rose from the wind that raced unbroken from horizon to horizon, from the rustle of dry reeds along the rivers, from the breath of creatures hidden in the earth. Beneath that endless sky, where herds moved like clouds across the steppe, something else stirred, smaller than dust, older than memory. It clung to the fur of marmots, slept in the blood of fleas, and waited for a chance to move. No one in those high plains knew its name, but centuries later it would be called Yersinia pestis, the seed of the Black Death. Long before the plague reached the gates of Europe, it had already found its kingdom in the east. The marmots burrowed along the Tian Shan ridges, and where they died, other animals came to feed. Fleas, desperate and starved, jumped from carcass to carcass, from beast to man. The steppe was a world without boundaries. Rivers were only roads of water, deserts only sea without waves. And into this boundless world rode the horsemen of the Mongol Empire. By the early 14th century, the Pax Mongolica had bound continents together. From China to the Black Sea, the Khans ruled over an empire of motion, couriers galloping day and night across the grasslands, caravans stretching like brown rivers between the mountains, ships waiting at every mouth of the great rivers. The empire's heart beat through these arteries of exchange, pulsing with silk, silver, grain, and slaves. But in those arteries, invisible, the plague began to travel. China was in turmoil. The Yuan emperors, heirs to Kublai Khan, ruled over a realm exhausted by its own size. Drought burned the fields of the north. Locusts devoured what little survived. Rivers flooded, then withdrew, leaving behind villages caked in salt and silence. In the markets of Hebei, starving peasants sold their children for grain. Chroniclers wrote of black swellings and sudden death before the bowl of rice is finished. Even before Europe had heard a whisper, whole provinces of China were already thinning out like mist. And yet, trade did not falter. It never did. The more famine struck, the more desperate men became to move goods, to move themselves. Silk caravans crossed the Gobi in great processions, their wheels biting into the ancient dust. At every way station, new beasts were hitched, new hands loaded the cargo, and new travelers joined the convoy. Each one brought something: a bag of tea, a bundle of pelts, a wound that would not heal. The plague's geography was patient. It moved from marmots to camels, from camels to men, from men to the rats that nested in their grain. It did not yet kill in waves, but in ripples. A trader found dead beside his pack. A fortress garrison half gone by morning. The living buried the dead and rode on, leaving behind the fleas to find fresh warmth. Somewhere near Lake Issyk-Kul, among the nomad settlements that ringed the water, the first clear signs appeared. A Christian monastery kept its death lists with pious precision. In one summer, the brothers buried dozens, more than in all the previous years combined. Their entries grew frantic. A swelling in the groin, the flesh turning black. Whole families perished. The ink fades halfway through the record, as though the scribe himself had succumbed midline. Rumor traveled faster than proof. Traders spoke of the Issyk-Kul sickness, of caravans found silent with all their beasts dead. Some said the wells were cursed, others that a demon had been loosed upon the steppe. Yet the merchants kept riding west. The Mongol world ran on commerce. To stop was to starve. By 1330, the plague had reached Samarkand, the jeweled city of the Silk Road. Its bazaars were thick with merchants from every corner of the earth. Persians with saffron, Indians with pepper, Chinese with silk. When the first coughs began, few noticed. When the first corpses appeared, they were burned quickly, as was custom. But the deaths did not end. Within weeks, the markets emptied, and the city's fountains ran clear of water because no one came to draw it. A camel train left Samarkand for the west, carrying silks and jade and the fleas in its bales. By the time it reached the Caspian coast, the drivers were sick, their eyes glassy, their lips dark. Those who survived abandoned the loads to thieves. The thieves, too, died soon after. Along the river valleys of the Volga and Don, villages went quiet. No proclamations marked their passing, only silence and crows. The Mongol Empire was no longer whole, yet its fragments still connected more of the world than any kingdom before it. The Khanates of the Golden Horde, Chagatai, Ilkhanate, and Yuan, were rivals, but their roads were shared. A merchant could travel from the Great Wall to the Black Sea under one language of trade and one law of tribute. The same networks that carried prosperity also carried death. At the courtyards of the yam posts, those horse-changing stations that kept the empire's communications alive, infected riders collapsed beside their saddles. Other riders took their letters, mounted fresh horses, and galloped away. Behind them, the rats fed on what they left. The plague moved on, faster than rumor, faster than prayer. By the early 1340s, it had crossed into the domains of the Golden Horde. The steppe between the Aral Sea and the Crimea became its new pasture. From caravan to caravan, it followed the same logic of trade. East to west, station to station, port to port. In the town of Sarai, near the mouth of the Volga, the bazaars began to empty. The Khan's tax collectors noted falling revenues, missing families, entire markets gone dark. Priests blamed unclean spirits. Healers burned aromatic herbs. The sickness did not listen. It had no gods to appease. At this same time, far to the west, the sea traders of Genoa had planted their colony on the Crimean coast, a city called Caffa, bright with marble and ambition. The Silk Road ended at its gates. Every spice, fur, and gem that came out of Asia passed through its docks before sailing toward the Mediterranean. The city thrived on the East's misfortune, never imagining that the plague which emptied markets in Samarkand would soon fill its own cemeteries. The road between Sarai and Caffa was crowded with merchants, Tatar guards, slaves, and pilgrims. It was also crowded with rats. They crept under wagons and hid in bales of cloth, their fleas drunk with infection. By 1345, caravans reaching the Black Sea spoke of sickness behind them. Cities abandoned, wells fouled, rivers thick with the dead. No one believed the stories. The Mongol world had survived so many wars, so many winters. This, they said, was just another fever of the East. But the East was coming west. The pestilence moved with a dreadful logic. In the beasts it caused fever and bleeding. In man it brought swollen nodes that turned black and split like ripe fruit. Sometimes it attacked the lungs, and a man would cough out his life in red froth. Sometimes it entered the blood, and death came before the prayer was finished. The forms were different, but the outcome was the same. Bodies too many to bury, silence too heavy to bear. Those who saw it first could not name it, yet they felt its intelligence. It seemed to move with purpose, following trade as a wolf follows scent. When the wind changed over the steppe, it carried not only dust, but the faint sweetness of decay. By 1346, the great east-west road, the artery of empire, had turned black. Merchants who left the interior arrived at the Black Sea, half dead. Some stumbled into the ports raving about demons. Others collapsed before they could speak. Behind them stretched 2,000 miles of silence. The world did not yet know that history had shifted. The Mongols, who once conquered by sword, now conquered by contagion. The same couriers who had brought silk and civilization would deliver ruin. From the lands where marmots still chattered to the quays of Caffa, where Genoese ships waited for cargo, the plague had completed its first journey. It had learned the roads of men, the rhythm of caravans, the patience of commerce. Soon it would learn the sea, and the sea was blue as hammered glass when the first corpses flew over the walls. They came with a slow, obscene grace, tumbling through the Crimean sunlight before striking the city's stones and bursting open like overripe fruit. For days the Genoese garrison had watched the Mongol catapults rise and fall beyond the ramparts, their ropes creaking like ship-rigging. What fell now was not rock or fire, but flesh, swollen, dark, and humming with flies. Inside Caffa, the stench spread faster than terror. The merchants who had once prided themselves on the perfumes of Alexandria and the spices of the Levant now gagged on the odor of rot. At first, they thought it another barbarian cruelty, some new stratagem from the horsemen who had once burned Kiev and enslaved Persia. They did not yet understand that the besiegers themselves were dying even faster than those within. The Khan of the Golden Horde, Janibeg, had come to punish the Italians for their insolence. Caffa, Feodosia, as the locals called it, was a Genoese jewel set in the Khan's own coastline, a thriving entrepot where furs, silk, and human beings changed hands. For decades, the Italians had grown rich there under Mongol license, skimming wealth from the empire's veins. But trade breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds rebellion. A quarrel in a market town had spilled blood. A Mongol had fallen, and Janibeg demanded vengeance. By the spring of 1346, his army encircled the city, its camp a forest of black tents fluttering with golden banners. Within the walls, the Genoese manned their towers, certain that stone and sea would preserve them. The siege dragged into summer. Then, among the tents of the besiegers, the coughing began. At first it was dismissed as another camp fever, the punishment of heat and filth. But the dead did not stay buried. Men shuddered with sudden fevers, their groins swelling into black lumps. Horses collapsed where they stood. The air thickened with the sound of flies. The Tartars began to die by the thousands. Even the Khan's own guards faltered. It was then that desperation bred invention. The story comes from a notary in Piacenza, Gabriele de Musi, who wrote that when Janibeg's soldiers could no longer fight, they fought with their dead. Catapults were loaded with corpses, their limbs bound in rags, their mouths open to the sky. They soared over the walls and crashed into the city's streets, where they shattered into clouds of rot and vermin. At night, the sea breeze carried the smell inward. The Genoese sealed their windows, burned incense, prayed to every saint of sea and trade. Yet the rats that fed in the Mongol camp had already found the drains beneath the city. In the dark, the plague crossed the threshold. By autumn, the defenders were dying as swiftly as the besiegers. Streets that once rang with the clatter of coins and the calls of dock workers grew silent except for the shriek of gulls. In the harbour, ships swung idly on their ropes. Some crews were already dead at anchor, their bodies stiff on the deck, eyes open to the sun. Others prepared to flee. Among those who escaped was a Genoese captain whose name has not survived. He loaded his galley with what remained of his cargo: cloth, oil, salted meat, and perhaps a few dying men who begged to be carried home. The vessel slipped out at dusk, oars dipping soundlessly. Beneath the planks, in the grain sacks and rope coils, the rats travelled too. That winter, storms swept the Black Sea. Some galleys vanished, others limped into the Bosphorus half crewless, their decks littered with bodies. Constantinople took them in. Within weeks, plague erupted in the city. The chronicler Demetrios Kydonis wrote, "Every day we carry our dead to burial, and every day the city becomes emptier." The sickness leapt from dock to dock, through the Greek quarter and into the palace servants' quarters, until even the emperor shut himself in the Blachanae palace, burning cedar and myrrh against the bad air. The plague followed the merchants as they fled, south to Alexandria, where the bazaars filled with coughing and the Nile turned sluggish with funeral barges. West to the islands, Cyprus, Crete, Rhodes, where sailors threw their dead overboard, only to find themselves coughing before landfall. And then, in October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys sailed into Messina. They had left Caffa months before, laden with silk and despair. The dock workers who came to unload them found men dying at the ropes. The city officials ordered the ships away, but the damage was done before the anchors were lifted. Rats scattered into the alleys. Fleas leapt from their hides into the warmth of human homes. Within days, the Sicilian port was a furnace of death. The contagion moved as if guided by logic, from Messina to Palermo, from Palermo to Catania, from Sicily across the straits into mainland Italy. It travelled 2, sometimes 3 miles a day, climbing valleys, crossing rivers. Along every road, it left the same marks: a groan, a swelling, a silence. In Venice, the Doge's council met to confront the impossible. They seized incoming ships, searched the holds, and when sickness was found, they burned the vessels on a barren island in the lagoon. The ashes drifted over the water like dark snow. From these measures would later come the word quarantina, 40 days of isolation. But in that first terror, there was no system, only instinct. The great port cities, Genoa, Marseille, Pisa, followed the same path. First disbelief, then fire, then the sound of bells tolling without pause. The trade that had enriched Europe now became its executioner. Back in the east, Caffa lay in ruins. When the survivors of both besiegers and besieged returned months later, they found the harbour choked with wreckage, the streets heaped with bones. Cats and dogs had multiplied. Human footprints were few. In the stillness, the wind still rattled the windows of abandoned houses. Some said the ghosts of the dead merchants walked the docks at night, calling in the language of Liguria for ships that would never come. But the sea had already carried their message. The pestilence that began with a marmot on the step had learned the rhythm of the tide. Wherever a ship's bell rang, the plague answered. As it moved west, the chronicler's pens began to tremble. The world's shape was changing, though no one yet could name it. A new geography was being drawn, not by conquest, but by contagion. The ancient centres of wealth, Venice, Florence, Paris, London, stood like candles in a storm, waiting for the wind to find them. From the decks of the fleeing Genoese, the sailors could still see the Crimean coast fading into mist. They believed they were sailing toward salvation, toward their own hearths and families. They did not know that below their feet, beneath the food stores and cargo, the rats were scratching, and that in their blood the invisible army marched on. The sea had become a mirror for death, calm, glittering, and endless. By the year's end, ships from the Black Sea were docking across the Mediterranean, and everywhere they went, the same pattern unfolded: fever, swelling, fire, silence. In monasteries, monks wrote that the air itself had turned poisonous. In markets, traders whispered that the Tartars had cursed them. In the harbours of Europe, rats poured down the gangplanks as if driven by a common hunger. What the Mongols had begun by catapult, the sea now finished by tide. The world's most lucrative trade network, built by ambition, stitched by greed, and maintained by faith in profit, had become a single thread of transmission, stretched from the deserts of Asia to the marble quays of Italy. As the galleys of Caffa disappeared beyond the horizon, the West awaited its inheritance, a darkness that no army, no prayer, no fortune could repel. Before dawn, a chain of ships slipped into Messina, their hulls black with pitch and their decks strangely quiet. Dock workers leaned on their poles, puzzled by the silence. Then a shout rang out, half warning, half prayer. Figures staggered on deck, faces blotched as if beaten, lips cracked, eyes milk white. By the time the harbour master found his voice and ordered the fleet away, ropes had already caught the moorings. In the shadows below, rats poured down the gangplanks as though escaping a burning world. Rumour spread faster than sense. People said it was a sea-born curse, a punishment brought by foreigners. Yet before Vespers, the first Sicilians were coughing blood. Priests refused to enter houses where whole families had gone still. In narrow lanes, smoke from rosemary and myrtle drifted through the air, and children asked if the smell of heaven was like this. Messina barred its gates, drove the ships away, and still the contagion multiplied behind the walls. The galleys that fled carried the same invisible cargo. By the time they reached Genoa and Marseille, the sailors were half dead, and the rats were exploring their new kingdoms. Merchants who unloaded the cargoes were stricken within days. Those who ran inland carried the plague further. Cities turned into traps of stone and water. Streets once loud with bells and traders fell quiet, except for the wheels of carts that hauled the dead to open ground. In Venice, the Republic's council met beneath frescoed ceilings, while outside, the canals stank of decay. Their decision was swift. All ships arriving from the east were to be held for 40 days before docking. 40 giorni, quarantine, a name for desperation. Sailors waiting on the water watched fires rise on the islands where infected vessels burned. The flames reflected on the lagoon like blood in glass. The measure came too late. Venice was a city of water and timber, an empire made for travel. The plague had already threaded itself through the alleys, moving by boat and by breath. Gondoliers dropped their poles and vanished beneath their own blankets. Within months, 60,000 were gone. Corpses filled chapels and cellars. Men carrying stretchers sang psalms until their voices gave out. Across the peninsula, other cities caught fire without flame. In Pisa, the markets emptied. In Milan, doors were bricked shut the moment a cough was heard. Florence, proud and perfumed, was still laughing when the shadow reached it. Spring of 1348 came bright and cruel. Flowers burst along the Arno. Bees thickened the air, and and the city's 10 bells sang of prosperity. Then servants began to sicken, a swelling in the groin, a black mark near the heart. Some recovered, but most did not. In the taverns, men spoke of a malady that moved like thought. Doctors blamed the stars, the air, the corruption of bodies. No one yet dared to call it what it was, the end of the world they knew. By May, the wealthy fled to their country villas, believing clean air could buy survival. They carried the pestilence with them, leaving behind locked houses where the shutters rattled against the wind. The poor were trapped, breathing the same foul air, watching the same carts roll past their doors. Fires burned in the squares as people tried to cleanse the sky. Smoke mixed with the odor of bodies until the whole city smelled of iron and ash. Giovanni Boccaccio later wrote that brother fled from brother, fathers from sons. He told of trenches beyond the walls, where corpses were layered like planks, covered with thin soil that the rains uncovered again. Dogs fed on the dead. Children threw stones at them and then died where they stood. The churchyards filled so quickly that the city appointed criminals to dig graves. Some dug for others in the morning and for themselves by night. Physicians arrived dressed for a war they could not win. Heavy leather coats, gloves, masks shaped like beaks stuffed with mint and lavender. They bled the sick, washed floors with vinegar, set bowls of crushed herbs at windows. When people saw the plague doctors approaching, they wept in relief and terror. The sight of salvation was the proof of no salvation at all. Florence's rulers tried to impose order. Guards patrolled the gates. The dying were carried to the outskirts. Still, the pestilence crept through every gap. Markets closed, courts emptied. Prayers were shouted from balconies. In the wealthier quarters, music played late into the night, a defiance born of disbelief. Revelers drank and danced, calling it a cure to keep the blood warm. The laughter never lasted long. By midsummer, half the city had vanished. Streets where looms once clattered were haunted by the flutter of washing, hung for owners who would never return. The bells of Santa Maria del Fiore tolled without pause, their sound flattening into a single note that seemed to come from the ground itself. Florentines began to bury their dead in gardens, beneath the floors of shops, anywhere the earth would yield. Rome fared no better. Pilgrims arrived seeking indulgences and carried death across the Tiber. Cardinals hid in their palaces, blessing each other through closed doors. The faithful believed that sin had taken visible form, that God had sent pestilence as a sermon louder than any priest could give. Yet even the monasteries emptied. Parchments remained on desks half-written, the ink clotted mid-sentence, as if the words themselves had sickened. Farther west, Pope Clement VI ruled from Avignon. His physician, Guy I de Chauliac, advised him to purify the air by fire. The Pope sat between two blazing hearths, the air thick with incense and fear. He survived, though 7,000 within his city did not. The Rhone became a river of burials. Bodies floated past vineyards that would not be harvested. Across Italy, measures multiplied. Houses with the sick were sealed, their doors marked with chalk. Some burned their furniture and fled. Others refused to flee their dead. Siena's new cathedral stood half-built, cranes frozen against the sky. The masons who had once raised stone in the name of heaven lay stacked beneath it. A chronicler wrote, "We began to build our towers to reach God, and he came down to meet us sooner than we wished." In Naples, in Milan, in the smallest Tuscan villages, the pattern repeated with perfect obedience. A cough, a swelling, a silence. The plague was learning Europe's map by heart. Not all believed it incurable. Physicians debated its nature. Was it a vapor, a poison, a punishment? Some ground emeralds into dust and mixed them with wine. Some recommended the eating of sour cherries. Others placed a live chicken on the swellings to draw the poison out. Remedies multiplied as bodies did. In Florence, survivors crept from hiding when the heat broke in September. They counted the missing and stopped when the numbers became absurd. Wages rose because no one was left to work. Grain rotted where it had been stored. The dead had left their fields to weeds and their houses to the wind. Rats scurried over doorsteps that had not been swept in months, indifferent heirs to human fortune. By year's end, the pestilence had crossed the Alps. Refugees carried it through the Rhine valley into France, whispering of angels with burning swords and comets that dripped fire. Behind them, Italy smouldered like a continent of extinguished candles. From the docks of Messina to the piazzas of Florence, the story was the same. Ships arriving, priests retreating, bells fading into silence. A merchant class that had once believed itself master of every sea now learned that no man commands a wind that carries death. And in the ruins left behind, a new truth began to take shape, one not yet spoken aloud, but felt in the marrow of survivors, that the world was changing not through conquest or invention, but through subtraction. Humanity had become smaller, and for the first time in memory, it knew it. By the winter of 1348, the wind carried more than cold. From the ports of Marseille, ships that had once glittered with silk and citrus came limping home, their sails tattered, their decks fouled with rats. Sailors staggered down the gangplanks, whispering of cities gone silent across Italy, of Florentines burying their children in gardens, of priests giving absolution from windows. The harbour guards who helped them ashore were coughing by nightfall. France had heard rumours for months, wild tales from the south about God's wrath and the end of days, but rumour had no odour, no texture. The truth did. It smelled of blood and salt and bodies sealed behind doors. Marseille was first to break. The plague entered through the markets, the taverns, the churches. The fishermen who dragged their nets along the shore began hauling up corpses instead. As the wind turned inland, the sickness followed the Rhone like a pilgrim. Within weeks, it reached Avignon, seat of the papacy and crossroads of Europe. The papal city was built for spectacle, its palaces carved like reliquaries, its streets full of foreign tongues. But wealth could not be quarantined. By spring, thousands were dead. The Pope, Clement VI, locked himself in a single chamber, with fires blazing at either side to purify the air. His physician, Guy I de Chauliac, tended him in leather gloves and prayed that knowledge might be armor. It was not. Guy worked until he too was stricken. In his Chirurgia Magna, he later confessed, "I fell into a continuous fever, and a great swelling grew in my groin. All believed me lost." He lanced his own boil with a surgeon's knife, drained it, and lived, one of the few healers who saw both the plague and what came after it. His survival made him famous. His honesty made him human. Outside, there was no order left to admire. Corpses filled the streets. The papal courtyards became burial pits. The Rhone was blessed as holy ground so that bodies might be thrown into it. Witnesses claimed 7,000 homes stood empty, their doors beating in the wind like broken wings. In Avignon, faith collided with fear. Processions wound through the city, penitents walking barefoot, faces streaked with ash. They sang hymns until the songs broke into sobs. But with every prayer, the contagion deepened. Monasteries emptied. Whole orders vanished from record. Even the flagellants, those wandering bands who whipped themselves bloody to appease God spread the disease with their own pilgrimages. The more they prayed, the faster they died. North of the river, the roads grew black with travelers, pilgrims, traders, soldiers from the 100 Years' War, each a vessel for the pestilence. Camps of refugees lined the fields outside towns. The sick pressed among the well. Priests walked among them with candles that guttered in the wind. Their Latin blessings became whispers, then silence. When the pestilence reached Montpellier, physicians gathered to write the first official treatise on the disaster. They examined the stars, the wind, and the rot of the earth. Their conclusion was a harmony of ignorance and eloquence. The planets, they said, had conjoined in the sign of Aquarius, corrupting the air. Poisoned mists rose from stagnant waters. Foul vapors entered the lungs and blackened the heart. They prescribed avoidance of warm baths, moderate laughter, and the burning of fragrant woods. None of it saved them. King Philip VI remained in Paris, ruling a kingdom that no longer obeyed. His armies along the Loire dissolved as soldiers deserted to bury their families. The machinery of government stuttered. Scribes who once copied decrees now copied death tolls. At court, courtiers wore emeralds to ward off infection, believing the stones drew poison from the body. Servants refused to pour wine for their masters. Nobility and beggars alike learned the same lesson, that a title could not bribe the invisible. From Avignon, the plague marched along the valleys into Toulouse, then west to Bordeaux, carried by riverboats and carts of grain. Where it passed, the pattern repeated. First denial, then smoke, then the sound of earth falling on coffins. In Rouen, a chronicler wrote, "It ran through the city like a horse in battle, trampling all before it." In Normandy, entire monasteries vanished in a season. In Brittany, fishing villages burned their boats, thinking the sea itself cursed. The clergy, once the backbone of consolation, were the first to crumble. The priests who survived became rare commodities. Absolution had a price. With half the monasteries emptied, confession gave way to confession's absence. Faith endured, but structure did not. The survivors prayed without guidance, each inventing his own liturgy. Paris met its fate with the arrogance of capitals. Scholars of the Sorbonne debated contagion as if it were a theory rather than a smell outside their doors. When it arrived in 1348, it came by the south gates and devoured the left bank first, the quarter of bakers, weavers, and students. Streets that had once hummed with disputation turned to corridors of ash. Chroniclers estimated that half the city, 100,000 souls, were gone by midsummer. In the Louvre, King Philip's physicians carried censers of ambergris and vinegar. He forbade burials within the city walls, but there was no outside left to send the bodies. Cemeteries overflowed. The dead were piled in trenches, layer upon layer, until the earth itself seemed to reject them. When the graveyards could hold no more, the Hôtel Dieu, Paris's great hospital, closed its doors for the first time in history. Still, the disease moved onward, indifferent to kings and scholars alike. Through Burgundy it slipped, through Champagne and the valleys of the Meuse, until it reached the frontiers of Flanders. The ports that traded with England became its next bridges. Europe had no walls tall enough to stop its own roads. By autumn of 1349, the French countryside lay emptied. Fields went untended, cattle wandered through the ruins of villages, and wolves came down from the forests to feed on what men had left behind. Grain rotted where it stood. In the towns that survived, prices soared. A loaf of bread cost 10 times its former worth. Laborers, suddenly precious, demanded wages that no lord could afford. Some were hanged for asking, others simply walked away, free for the first time in memory. Among the living, a strange quiet settled. There was grief, yes, but also a fierce clarity. The world had been weighed and found fragile. Peasants spoke to priests as equals. Merchants bought the houses of vanished nobles. And the church, so used to command, found itself begging for obedience. The hierarchy that had seemed eternal was crumbling in the dust of its own mortality. Yet amid the ruin, people still looked to heaven. Artists painted frescoes of skeletons dancing hand in hand with kings. Carvers etched skulls into church doors. Death had become a neighbor to be acknowledged, even invited in. In the cloisters of Chartres, monks began to write music in minor tones, laments that bent the air like mourning cloth. By year's end, France was no longer a kingdom of people, but of echoes. The plague had emptied its granaries, toppled its faith, and hollowed its language. Whole dialects vanished with the mouths that spoke them. And yet the survivors endured, stubbornly making bread, counting coins, lighting candles for the dead. From the windows of Avignon, Pope Clement could see the Rhine shining beneath the moon, a mirror for all that had passed. He called for prayers for the soul of Europe, though he must have known that prayer was already the only thing Europe had left. The pestilence was moving northward, through the lowlands and toward the Channel winds, where another island waited, unknowing, to receive it. As the bells of France were still tolling, the first English ships hoisted their sails. Autumn of 1348 arrived soft and golden across the southern coasts of England, the harvest heavy, the fields humming with work. No one saw the ships at first, not until they were already in the harbour of Melcombe Regis, later called Weymouth, rolling gently on the tide. They came from Gascony, their decks strewn with barrels of wine and bales of cloth, and a silence that meant danger. Within days, the dockworkers were dead. England had believed itself an island fortress. The sea that had kept out invaders could not keep out the plague. From the southern ports, it followed the trade roads inland. At Dorchester and Bristol, people spoke of a strange fever that killed before the sun returned. Along the Thames, the barges carried more than goods. The sickness moved at the pace of commerce, along the same channels that had once made the realm rich. London felt it before Christmas. The city was vast by medieval measure, 80,000 souls, the air thick with coal smoke and the smell of beasts. When the pestilence arrived, it came like fog off the river, indistinct and absolute. In the alleys near Smithfield, the dead lay in heaps beside the living. No one counted the days between health and death anymore. The difference was a blink. Chroniclers described the sores first appearing in the armpit or the groin, like apples of death. Then the cough, red with blood. Some died in hours. Others lingered, raving, half aware. The hospitals overflowed. The graveyards could not absorb the losses. In the field at East Smithfield, the Crown ordered a new cemetery dug, 40 yards wide, 60 deep. Bodies arrived faster than earth could cover them. Monks worked until their arms trembled, then stopped burying and began to bless from afar. King Edward III had only recently defeated the French at Crécy, and England still feasted on its victories. He was not a man who believed in omens, but the letters arriving from his sheriffs spoke of cities dissolving into ash. In Winchester, 40% gone. In Bristol, worse. The king ordered prayers said across the realm, and then withdrew to Windsor, taking his court and his silence with him. In London, Archbishop Bradwardine died within a week of consecration. Churches lost their priests faster than they could be replaced. Men who once feared heresy began to fear empty pulpits more. Parish by parish, the hierarchy of faith collapsed, leaving villages to fend for their own souls. Through the winter, the bells tolled until there were no bell ringers left. The living tried to carry on with the precision of habit. Bread baked, goods sold, courts convened. But when jurors began dying in the middle of trials, even law deferred to mortality. Wills were written on scraps of parchment, sometimes in the same hand that closed the dead man's eyes. By spring 1349, the plague had learned England's map. It followed the river valleys north toward Oxford and Cambridge, devouring the university towns. Scholars burned their manuscripts for warmth, fleeing to villages that were already infected. Those who stayed left their names inked in the margins of half-finished books. At Oxford's Merton College, a single scholar recorded the date of his friends' deaths in a trembling Latin hand. And then no more entries came. The disease spread like rumour. Some said it drifted on the air, others that it came by contact, a curse that clung to clothing and skin. People avoided touch, even with family. Husbands and wives slept apart. Mothers left bread by the doors of their children's rooms. When one coughed, the other ran. The pestilence moved west to Wales, carried by traders and pilgrims, and north into the Midlands. It left entire parishes hollowed out, the fields lying fallow. Sheep roamed untended, their wool hanging in clotted ropes. The countryside filled with silence, broken only by the wind against the hedges. Chroniclers wrote of wolves returning to old hunting grounds and of deer grazing in deserted churchyards. In May, the sickness reached Scotland, not through invasion, but through mockery. The Scots, convinced that England was being punished by heaven, gathered a great army at Selkirk Forest to invade their weakened neighbour. Before the attack could begin, their camp sickened. The plague tore through the tents in a week. Chroniclers said the revenging hand of God struck them down, leaving the hills strewn with their bodies. The same wind that carried laughter from their fires carried the disease northward into their villages. To the west, Ireland waited. English ships brought not trade, but contagion to Dublin and Drogheda. Gaelic lords in the hinterlands mocked the settlers, calling the pestilence the foreigner's death until it found them too. Monks in Kilkenny wrote that the countryside lay silent, for the sound of human voices had ceased. Fields that had fed kingdoms were left to the crows. The statistics defy imagination. Perhaps half the island dead, perhaps more. In some places, there was no one left to bury the fallen. Graves were dug by survivors who died before they could finish their work. The air turned sour, and no one dared light candles for fear of drawing the sickness in through the flame. England's government barely breathed. Parliament met only once, its members sitting far apart, faces covered with cloths soaked in vinegar. Edward's messengers rode from shire to shire, recording the losses. In some towns, 1 in 3. In others, 9 of 10. By year's end, so many manors lay empty that royal taxes collapsed. The sheriffs stopped collecting coin and began collecting prayers. In the ashes, a strange inversion began. Labourers were few and lords desperate. A man who had once begged for work could now command his price. Wages rose by half in some counties, and still the harvest rotted. The king's advisers warned that this freedom would unmake the realm. In 1351, Edward decreed the Statute of Labourers, fixing wages at the old rate and forbidding workers to leave their manors. Few obeyed. The pestilence had loosened more than bodies. It had loosened the chain of custom itself. Those who lived saw the world with new eyes. They had carried their dead to the pits and returned to find the earth unrecognizable. Children inherited lands they could not plough. Widows inherited debts that no longer mattered. Faith, once unquestioned, wavered under the weight of too many unanswered prayers. Some turned to penance, others to pleasure. Across England, there were rumours of men and women wandering from town to town, half holy, half mad, crying that the end had come and gone already. In London, survivors began to creep back to their trades. The sound of hammers returned, the faint clink of coin. But every noise seemed thinner, echoing in a space once filled with lives. The cemeteries at Smithfield and Clerkenwell grew green again, the grass hiding what it covered. A few priests dared to say that perhaps the wrath had passed. Yet the air itself felt altered, emptier, lighter, as though the city had exhaled and could not draw breath again. Rats still moved along the riverbanks, indifferent heirs to empire. By 1350, the pestilence was fading, or perhaps merely pausing. It left behind a kingdom bruised but unbroken, a people smaller yet more defiant. The survivors ploughed fields that had known too much death, and the first green shoots rose through the turned earth as if mocking memory. From the cliffs of Dover, sailors could see the French coast through the haze, its own villages as silent as theirs. Between the two shores lay the same grey water that had once promised separation and now offered only reflection. The Black Death had crossed the channel as quietly as a rumour and changed the island forever. What had begun in the burrows of marmots and the camps of Mongols now ruled the destiny of kings. No one knew that it would return. From the south, the pestilence drifted across the Alps as if drawn by the scent of trade. Caravans that had left Italy full of spices and silk reached the Rhine with half their men gone. What they carried in their wagons could not be unloaded or weighed, a hunger that fed on lungs and faith alike. At Basel, the river shone as it always had, busy with ferries and merchant rafts. Then one morning, a butcher collapsed at his stall. By nightfall, his apprentices were dead. Within a week, the city stank of resin and fear. Smoke curled from every quarter as people burned juniper and pine to cleanse the air. The bells rang until the ropes frayed in their pulleys. From the south gate to the cathedral square, the sound of coughing was continuous, a tide that never receded. No one in the empire could claim surprise. Letters had been coming north for months, describing Italy's ruin and the silence of France. Yet distance breeds disbelief. The citizens of Strasbourg had prayed that the mountains would hold the sickness back. They discovered instead that plague travels downhill faster than water. When the first fevers began, the guilds closed their halls and the magistrates met in secret. By the new year, secrecy was useless. Entire streets lay deserted, their doors swinging in the wind. The Rhine had become a mirror for smoke, and with fear came rage. Rumour is a kind of contagion, and in the Holy Roman Empire, it spread as swiftly as the disease itself. Whispers rose in taverns and churches. The wells had been poisoned. The Jews had done it, people said, to destroy Christendom. Logic was a frail defense. The pestilence killed Jews and Christians alike, but terror never listens to arithmetic. In January 1349, Strasbourg erupted. The city fathers had sworn to protect their Jewish quarter. Yet when the mob assembled, merchants, apprentices, widows, priests, they opened the gates instead. The synagogue was stormed, homes looted. Those who would not convert were herded into a wooden structure built for the purpose. The doors were barred and torches thrown in. Chroniclers say 2,000 died in the fire. and that the crowd sang psalms as it burned. From there, the pogroms moved with the plague itself: Mainz, Cologne, Worms, Basel. In some towns, the Jews were expelled, in others, massacred. Cities that escaped infection still filled their streets with ashes. When Emperor Charles IV condemned the killings from his court in Prague, his words arrived too late. The empire's veins had already blackened. In the chaos, a new form of devotion appeared. They called themselves the Flagellants. They came in bands of hundreds, barefoot and bare to the waist, moving from village to village in the name of repentance. Each carried a scourge made of knotted leather thongs tipped with iron. They marched in rhythm, chanting hymns, then fell to their knees and beat themselves until the blood ran into the dust. Townsfolk wept to see them, believing heaven might be moved by their suffering. But wherever the Flagellants went, the plague followed. They slept in church porches, bathed in the same rivers, left behind trails of infection. At first, the clergy tolerated them. Later, Pope Clement denounced them as heretics. By then, it no longer mattered. Their processions had crossed half of Germany, a pilgrimage of pain that mirrored the disease's own path. The Holy Roman Empire was not a single kingdom, but a web of cities, each proud, independent, slow to agree. In some, like Nuremberg and Augsburg, councils tried to impose order: fumigations, isolation, fines for burying corpses within walls. They decreed that victims' clothing be burned and houses sealed. Yet behind every sealed door, another cough began. The plague paid no tax to authority. In Cologne, priests carried censers filled with amber and tar, and still the air thickened. One chronicler wrote that the world seemed to shrink each day, as though God were drawing it back into his sleeve. On the eastern frontier, in Bohemia and Hungary, Emperor Charles IV issued proclamations for prayer and fasting. He forbade persecution of Jews and the looting of towns, promising punishment to offenders. But the emperor's reach was weaker than the fear that carried from mouth to mouth. Refugees poured eastward, bringing contagion and panic in equal measure. Villages burned their own bridges to keep strangers out. The plague rolled on through Swabia, Franconia, Saxony. It did not move evenly. Some valleys were spared, some wiped clean. Historians would later say that the rhythm of death followed trade routes exactly, as if the disease could read a map. In the towns that survived, the world seemed to tilt. Skilled craftsmen vanished, leaving their workshops to apprentices. The price of every loaf and nail doubled. In some places, masters offered freedom to their serfs in exchange for labor. In others, no bargains were struck because there was no one left to make them. When the death slowed in late 1349, people emerged blinking into the light as if from caves. Streets lay half collapsed, weeds pushing through the cracks. Survivors called to one another across the squares, in voices hoarse from disuse. Some churches had no clergy left to reopen them. Some cities no council to govern them. And yet, the empire endured. In the towns along the Rhine, rebuilding began almost before the graves had settled. Guilds reformed, though smaller. Markets reopened, though quieter. Out of necessity, new rules took hold. Travelers from distant places were inspected, their goods washed in vinegar. City gates were locked at night and opened only for those who could name themselves. These measures, the beginnings of border control, were born not from science but from fear, yet they were the first fragile architecture of public health. By the time the pestilence reached the eastern marches, its power was waning. The air grew colder, the fleas fewer. The disease crossed into Poland and Hungary, but lost much of its fury. Chroniclers in Krakow wrote of towns spared altogether, though they could not explain why. Some said their isolation saved them, others credited the number of cats. The truth was simpler: chance. In Prague, Charles IV ordered prayers of thanksgiving. He believed the empire delivered, but travelers from the West brought stories that turned gratitude to dread. France half empty, England hollowed, Italy still smoking. Europe had not been struck evenly. It had been shaken, its center of weight moved. Along the Rhine, vineyards sprouted wild where workers had died, their grapes shriveling on unpruned vines. Churches carved new memorials faster than new sermons. Artists painted skeletons leading kings and peasants in the same grim procession. What the plague left behind was not merely loss, but a new imagination of equality, terrible, leveling, and unforgettable. By 1350, the pestilence was receding like a spent tide. The Rhine ran clear again. The air smelled of pine instead of ash. But the survivors had changed. They had seen the walls of faith and empire crumble at a touch. The flagellants had been silenced, the mob scattered, the smoke dispersed. But in the minds of men, something remained. The knowledge that death needed no permission, no banner, no reason. The Holy Roman Empire, that patchwork of altars and markets, had been tested not by war or heresy, but by breath itself, and found how thin its fabric truly was. Far to the north, where the rivers turned toward the Baltic, another rumor was forming. Ships arriving in Bergen, Norway, their decks silent, their sails unmoving, bringing with them a familiar cargo. The plague was not finished. It was simply changing direction. As the winds changed, no one remembered the name of the first ship. It came from England in late summer of 1349, drifting into Bergen's harbour with its sails slack and its crew already half dead. Dock workers shouted to the captain and received no answer. When they climbed aboard, they found the deck scattered with bodies and the rats as lively as the living. By nightfall, Bergen's wharves were silent. Norway had been a kingdom of fishermen and traders, a country bound to the sea as firmly as a net to its weights. Every fjord was a road, every harbour a door. The plague entered through those doors easily, gliding up the coast with the tides. Within a month, the merchant towns of Trondheim and Oslo were coughing in unison. Priests burned incense in their churches until they choked on it. Fishermen knelt on their decks, crossing themselves between the waves. King Magnus ruled both Norway and Sweden then, a man torn between his realms and his family. His son died first, then his courtiers, then his messengers. Before winter, the king's letters were carried by boys too young to shave. They brought only bad news. One town after another gone quiet. Farms standing empty beside frozen fields. The royal seal meant little when there was no one left to read it. In Bergen, graveyards filled so quickly that burials moved to the beaches. Monks hauled the bodies out by sled and covered them with stones against the tide. The cold did not slow the contagion. It merely preserved the dead as if the land itself refused to let them rot. The sickness travelled inland along the rivers and over the mountain passes, where traders had long carried iron and furs. Whole valleys lost their voices. A priest in Voss recorded that no man rang the bells, for there was no man left to ring them. Villages vanished so completely that in later years only their place names remained. Hollow syllables on maps, the ghosts of communities swallowed by snow. When spring returned, the survivors crawled out of their houses like animals from burrows. They found the fields overgrown and the cattle wild. Some spoke of hearing children's cries from the forests, of seeing smoke from hearths where no roads led. Perhaps it was imagination, perhaps the country itself was remembering. Sweden suffered later, but longer. The plague came north by ship and cart, reaching Stockholm in 1350. It met a land already strained by hunger. The harvests had failed for 2 years, and the towns were swollen with refugees. When the sickness arrived, it found no resistance. The city's narrow alleys became funnels of contagion. Even the royal court fled to the countryside, taking the disease with it. Monks at Uppsala wrote of a fever that devoured whole houses in a single night. They buried the dead in communal pits, then added themselves to the count. On the island of Gotland, sailors refused to dock, circling the coast for weeks until starvation forced them ashore. None lived to tell what happened after. Across the straits, Denmark was already burning. The plague had arrived there the same year, spreading from the trading ports of Ribe and Aalborg. It crept inland through the marshlands and along the cattle paths into Jutland's villages, where families slept beside their animals for warmth. When the animals began to die too, the people understood that there was no protection left on earth. In Copenhagen, merchants from the Hanseatic League closed their warehouses, posting guards who would not approach within spear's length. Rats found the gaps easily. The contagion travelled not by will, but by instinct. Ship to ship, bale to bale. The wealth that had tied the Baltic together became its own undoing. The cities of the Hanseatic coast, Lübeck, Danzig, Riga, received the news by rumour and the disease by sea. In the taverns of Lübeck, sailors told stories of London's great pits and Avignon's fires. The townsfolk listened, shuddered, and returned to their ale. Within a fortnight, their own taverns were silent. Chroniclers would later count that half the Baltic's trading population vanished in 2 years, but numbers could not convey the stillness that followed. Ships went adrift, their crews dead, their cargo intact. Fishermen found them at dawn and, curious, climbed aboard. The pattern repeated itself in port after port. Bergen, Riga, Reval, all learned that curiosity was another word for contagion. By 1350, Norway was scarcely a kingdom at all. The countryside had emptied, the farms left to ruin. Wolves came down from the highlands and lingered in the villages. Roads over the passes vanished under weeds. Some survivors gathered in clusters, building churches of unhewn timber as if to bargain with heaven. Others roamed the coastlines, scavenging from abandoned boats. Chroniclers spoke of one such village high in the mountains, a place later called Setedal, where nearly every inhabitant died. When rescuers arrived months later, they found only a single girl, half feral, living among the goats. She had forgotten how to speak. Her name, they said, was Ripe. Whether she was real or myth, she became the country's emblem, the last voice of a vanished people. Farther east, the plague brushed the forests of Finland and moved on. The thinly scattered settlements and the cold itself broke its rhythm. In Iceland, word arrived years before the disease did, and by then, the island had closed its harbours. Isolation proved its mercy. The sea, which had once been death's highway, now became its wall. Few there sickened, fewer died. Across Scandinavia, the pattern was the same. A first wave of terror, a long echo of emptiness. By 1351, the pestilence had receded into the northern sea, leaving behind a continent rearranged. Norway's population had fallen by half, Denmark's nearly as much. Sweden lost its priests, its harvests, and much of its nobility. The lineages that survived would rule smaller kingdoms. built on the memory of absence. From the wreckage rose new laws and customs. In Denmark, land once held by great lords passed to commoners. In Sweden, the crown took abandoned estates, binding the realm more tightly under the king. Labour became precious. Peasants bargained for wages their grandfathers would have called impossible. The north was poor but freer than before. In the ports that survived, traders returned to their ledgers, though they wrote with a slower hand. The Hanseatic merchants, hardened by loss, began to build quarantine houses and to fumigate their cargo with vinegar and smoke. These small acts of control were the first scaffolds of modern order, born not of knowledge but of memory. For generations, Norwegians would speak of Den Store Mandauden, the great mortality, as if it were a season rather than an event. Children born long after would point to empty ruins on the hillsides and say that once whole families had lived there until the air turned against them. When the wind blew from the south, carrying the smell of the sea and tar, the old would fall silent. They had learned that the same wind that brought fish and trade could also bring silence, and that silence could last for 100 years. The Black Death had reached the edges of the known world and still found no end to its appetite. But even death, like weather, must change direction. By the early 1350s, its tide was turning back toward the east, toward the empire of the Greeks, the deserts of the Mamluks, and the ancient cities that had given it its first name. The plague was leaving the north behind, though it would never quite let it go. Along the Bosphorus, where two continents touch and argue, the direction shifted eastward once more. The ships that brought the plague to Europe did not all sail west. Some turned back, following the same blue corridors that had once borne emperors, pilgrims, and prophets. The Pestilence had no allegiance. It moved toward Constantinople as if drawn by history itself. By late 1347, the Byzantine capital was already fragile, a faded heirloom from another age. Its walls still gleamed white in the sunlight, but its empire had dwindled to islands and memories. Trade from the Black Sea still poured through its harbors, and with it came the rats. Within weeks, the narrow streets between the Hippodrome and the Golden Horn filled with the smell of burning pitch. Citizens spoke of the fever that emptied houses overnight. Chroniclers later guessed that half the city's people were gone before spring. Emperor John VI Cantacuzene wrote of the horror himself. All human endeavors, he said, were of no avail. Every man feared the touch of his brother. He buried his son with his own hands, then sealed the palace gates. The guards died at their posts. The monks of the Blackernay monastery chanted prayers until their voices failed, and when the last of them died, the candles burned on without them. From Constantinople, the pestilence leapt across the sea lanes into Anatolia, Syria, and Palestine. The world that had once been Rome's eastern half, now divided between Christians and Muslims, received the same visitation with equal helplessness. In the Ottoman frontier towns along the Marmara, soldiers sickened before they could draw their swords. The young Sultan, Orhan, shut his capital of Bursa and forbade funerals for fear of rebellion. In the ports of Asia Minor, trade ceased abruptly. Caravans from the east arrived with no buyers waiting, markets filled with goods and silence. The plague rode with them inland, along the caravan roads to Aleppo and Damascus, and down the valleys of the Levant. Cairo, heart of the Mamluk Empire, and the greatest city of the Arabic world, fell next. When the contagion reached it in 1349, the city was swollen with pilgrims returning from Mecca. Crowds gathered at the mosques to pray for deliverance, but by night the courtyards were filled with bodies. One chronicler wrote that The air became thick with lamentation, and the grave diggers grew rich. Among those who survived was Ibn Khaldun, a young scholar who would later write of the world's unraveling. Civilization, both in the East and the West, was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish, he recalled. His parents died in the same week. From that wound came his theory of history, that every empire carries the seed of its own decay, and that even knowledge can die. Egypt's Nile became a funeral procession. Grain boats that once fed the world were left to drift, their crews gone. Markets stood empty. The Sultan's treasuries overflowed with coin that no one could spend. In the deserts beyond Cairo, Bedouin tribes watched the cities weaken and began raiding the trade routes again. Civilization recoiled into its fortresses. Damascus endured its turn soon after. The city's chroniclers counted 10,000 dead in a single day, then stopped counting. Minarets that once called the faithful to prayer now rang with the sound of weeping. Imams and priests alike declared days of fasting, processions of repentance, and almsgiving for the dead. The more they prayed, the faster the plague seemed to move. When it reached Jerusalem, the city of all faiths, each religion accused the others. The Jews were walled into their quarter, the Christians barred their churches, and the Muslims sealed the dome of the rock. Yet the sickness moved between them all, impartial as wind. Across the Red Sea, Mecca and Medina saw their pilgrim roads deserted. Caravans stopped at oases and did not continue. In Baghdad, once the jewel of learning, scholars died in their libraries. Scribes were found slumped over Qurans, half-copied, their ink still wet. The Tigris carried bodies down from the north until it seemed a river of ink itself. Persia was already weakened by war and drought. The Ilkhanate, what remained of the Mongol dominion, collapsed completely under the double weight of famine and disease. Cities that had been capitals for conquerors became ruins overnight. Along the old Silk Road, the plague returned to the steppes that had first given it birth. Everywhere it went, the pattern was the same. Cities emptied, faith deepened, order dissolved. Yet each culture recorded the disaster in its own tongue. In Christian lands, the plague was the scourge of a wrathful God. In Muslim lands, it was a test, a martyrdom granted to the faithful. The faithful dug graves facing Mecca and called them gardens. Some saw in the pestilence the fulfillment of prophecy, one of the signs before the last judgment. In their fear, men still looked for meaning, even in annihilation. What made the eastern lands different was their learning. Arabic physicians had inherited the science of Galen and the mathematics of Alexandria. They studied contagion with a precision Europe lacked. They knew the disease passed through breath and proximity. They forbade gatherings, cleaned the streets, fumigated the air with musk and aloe. But knowledge could not defeat numbers. When there were too few to clean the bodies, even scholars turned to prayer. From Egypt, the infection traveled west into North Africa, following the same routes as gold and salt. In Tunis, the ruling family perished within a fortnight. From there, ships carried it to the ports of Morocco, and merchants carried the news across the Sahara. The oases of the desert became way stations of despair. By the time the caravans reached the Niger, their loads of cloth and coin were worthless. The buyers were dead. The plague's circle was closing. It had begun in the east, crossed to the west, and now returned again. In the space of 6 years, it had visited every civilization of the known world. The survivors in Constantinople looked out from their walls and saw ships returning from Alexandria and Trebizond, bringing grain and, again, the faint scent of sickness. They burned their incense, washed their docks with seawater, and prayed that the circle would finally break. But history rarely ends cleanly. Pockets of infection lingered in the harbours, in the rats that gnawed the ropes of merchant ships, in the warehouses where grain waited for buyers who never came. The empire was smaller now, its streets emptier, its prayers quieter. When travellers passed through, they described a city that seemed built for ghosts. In the deserts beyond Damascus, an old man pointed to the horizon and told a caravan, "It has gone back to the steppe. Perhaps it will rest." He was half right. The pestilence was not finished. It was only retreating, like an army gathering its strength. The world it left behind was changed beyond recognition. The trade that had bound continents together was broken. The pilgrimage routes of faith lay abandoned. The scholars of East and West alike had written their last words with trembling hands. Still, life crept back. In Cairo's ruins, children began to play beside the river. Farmers returned to their fields, ploughing between the bones of their ancestors. In the alleys of Constantinople, the first market stalls reopened, selling incense instead of bread. Survival itself became a kind of defiance. In its passage, the plague outlined the shape of the old world and exposed its frailty. From the grasslands to the shores, from great empires to empty sands, one truth endured. The roots of wealth are also roots of return, and nothing walks the world alone. Not gold, not faith, not death. Morning came without sound. Across Europe, the fields lay unploughed, the mills idle, the roads empty, save for the weeds that sprouted through their ruts. Villages had become mirages, chimneys standing in the haze like gravestones, doors unbarred, hearths cold. Crows circled above orchards that had dropped their fruit untouched. The plague had moved on, but what it left behind was not peace. It was vacancy. In the years that followed the Great Dying, the living groped their way through a new kind of quiet. There were not enough hands to ring the bells or to gather the harvest. Those who survived walked with a hesitant step, as though sound itself might break them. They found their neighbours gone and their churches half empty. In some parishes, no one remained who could read the Latin of the prayers. In others, no one remained to listen. The old order had depended on numbers. Serfs bound to the land, monks to their rules, lords to their obligations. Now the equation no longer balanced. On many estates, entire families had vanished, leaving behind tilled earth and tools still sharp. Oxen broke their tethers and wandered through the villages. When the wind rose, it carried the creak of empty signboards and the rattle of shutters that no one came to close. Some called it deliverance. Peasants who once bowed to every command began to bargain. With so few left to sow and reap, the value of a pair of hands rose higher than a noble's pride. Landlords who had ruled by right of birth found themselves pleading with their tenants to stay. Wages doubled, then trebled. The harvests went ungathered anyway. In England, the New World became visible first. The pestilence had killed half her labourers. The survivors discovered they were indispensable. A ploughman might demand 2 pence where once he earned one, and the Lord had little choice but to agree. Parliament, uneasy with such freedom, passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, declaring that no man should receive higher wages than before the plague. It was a law written for the dead, and the living ignored it. Across France, the same pattern unfolded. Manor houses crumbled into ruin. Peasants took over abandoned fields, planting for themselves and paying no rent. The old feudal bonds loosened one by one. Some nobles married into the families of their former tenants to preserve their lands. Others rode out with their retainers to enforce obedience and returned to find their own villages deserted. Yet prosperity born of death carried its own poison. The survivors were richer, but the markets smaller. Fields went to pasture because there were no farmers to tend them. Sheep multiplied where grain had grown, feeding the new wool trade and starving the old bread supply. Europe's stomach had changed its diet. In some places, hunger returned, not because there was no food, but because there was no one left to cook it. Monasteries stood like emptied shells. Thousands of monks had perished tending the sick, and the silence of their cloisters was absolute. Bells no longer marked the hours of prayer. The gardens overran their walls. When novices were finally admitted again, they came from humbler stock, sons of artisans and peasants, men who saw devotion less as a calling than as survival. The church rebuilt its ranks, but it never regained its voice. With priests dead and confessions scarce, lay brotherhoods sprang up across the countryside. Men and women meeting in barns to pray without hierarchy. They spoke in their own tongues rather than in Latin, believing that God understood the speech of the poor. From these gatherings would one day come reformers and heretics, but for now they were simply the echoes of faith, filling the spaces where clergy had been. The arts turned inward. Carvers began to decorate church walls with skeletons, dancers, and hourglasses. Painters showed kings and beggars sharing the same grave. The danse macabre spread from mural to mural, its grim humor a way of rehearsing what everyone already knew. In music, the sweetness of earlier centuries gave way to darker harmonies. Even joy carried a minor note. Children born after the plague grew up without memory of crowds. They inherited wide spaces and thin kinship. The old families of Europe were gone, their bloodlines broken. A noble might find himself heir to 5 estates and no cousins. A farmer might work land once divided among 10. The survivors spoke of it as the thinning, as if humanity itself had been pruned back by an invisible gardener. Demographers of later centuries would estimate that 1/3 of the continent had perished, though in some regions, Tuscany, Flanders, Norway, the loss reached half. Cities suffered worst, where the air was thick and the rats uncounted. Rural villages fared little better. Isolation was protection only until the next traveler arrived. The pattern was uneven but universal. No country escaped untouched. Where governments still functioned, they turned to counting. In Florence, a new census recorded half the households of the old one. In Paris, tax rolls were rewritten with gaps like missing teeth. The Holy Roman Empire tried to measure its losses and found that even the scribes had died. The habit of administration survived only because someone had to write down how little was left. By 1353, the first signs of recovery glimmered through the wreckage. In Lombardy and the Low Countries, populations began to creep upward. Fewer mouths meant fuller bellies. The soil, left fallow for years, yielded more generously than before. Those who remained were stronger, hardened by inheritance and necessity. The plague had culled indiscriminately, yet in its wake came a generation more resilient. Bodies shaped by survival, immune perhaps to what had killed their parents. Not every change could be counted in numbers. The great age of piety that had defined medieval life began to buckle under the weight of disappointment. People had prayed, and still they had died. The church's answers felt thin against the memory of empty pews. Doubt spread quietly, like a second contagion. Men began to question not only the priests, but the world's design. If death could take bishop and beggar alike, then perhaps salvation depended less on obedience than on understanding. Some scholars claimed the pestilence had purified mankind. Others called it proof of corruption. Both agreed that nothing would ever return to what it had been. The very shape of villages changed. Fewer cottages, wider plots, new roads drawn to connect the living rather than to memorialize the dead. Language shifted too. Words for neighbor, family, and charity acquired edges of fear. In the late summer of 1354, a farmer in Burgundy described hearing birdsong for the first time in years. He said it startled him more than the silence had. The world was relearning its sound. By then, the plague's first wave was over, but smaller outbreaks still flared like sparks in dry grass. Each one reminded the living how thin the border was between their recovery and its undoing. Europe stood at the beginning of something it could not yet name. The pestilence had ended the old century in everything but date. The generations that followed would till the ground of a different world, one sown in grief, watered with opportunity, and haunted by memory. The bells that rang again in those years carried a new tone, lower and slower. They were no longer warnings or farewells. They were proof of endurance, marking time for a continent that had outlived its own heartbeat. The survivors thought the horror had passed. They had buried the dead, mended the fields, rebuilt their markets. Children were playing again in churchyards once filled with graves. The air seemed lighter, the world newly washed. Then, in the late spring of 1361, the sickness returned. It came not as memory, but as surprise, moving with a swiftness that mocked the lessons of the past. People called it the pestis secunda, the second pestilence, and some whispered that it was a new creature entirely. It favored the young this time, as though seeking the children of those who had escaped before. Villages that had slowly regained their laughter fell silent again. Mothers buried their sons in the same ground where their own parents lay. In chronicles and sermons, it became known as the Children's Plague. Europe, leaner and warier, met the new assault differently. In the towns of Flanders, doors were sealed at the first cough. Venetian ships flew black flags and waited out the quarantine in their lagoons. Milan bricked up infected houses as before, and again it survived better than its neighbours. The measures worked in patches, failing as often as they succeeded. A single rat could still undo a city. In England, the pestilence returned to a country already changed. The old feudal bonds had loosened. The peasants knew their worth. Harvests went untended as fear spread, but there were fewer mouths to feed, and that saved the realm from famine. King Edward III, grown older and slower, renewed his prayers and his statutes. His clerks recorded that by 1362, half the clergy trained since the first outbreak were dead. It seemed to mock every effort at renewal. The disease itself moved differently. Some who had survived the earlier plague now resisted it. Others died faster than before. Physicians began to suspect a mystery within the blood. Some invisible favor granted to a few. They could not name it, but immunity was being born quietly, in the marrow of those who endured. Across France, the people were too tired for panic. They had fought the English for 20 years, rebuilt their towns, and watched the plague return like a tax collector. In Paris, one chronicler wrote, "We have learned to die without astonishment." The clergy tried to rekindle devotion, calling for fasts and processions, but the crowds were small. Faith had grown cautious. Even the prayers were shorter. Economically, the aftershocks were everywhere. Wages remained high, though coin had lost its value. Inflation gnawed at every corner of society. Bread doubled in price, land halved. Moneylenders, already distrusted, now became essential. In Florence, the Medii were rising. In Bruges, the wool merchants tightened their grip. The death of labourers made machines desirable. Watermills multiplied, new looms appeared, and the first hints of mechanical industry took root among ruins. Those who still traded spoke a new language of risk. Italian city-states established health offices, magistres sanitatis, to inspect arriving ships, record deaths, and order fumigations. Venice built wooden lazarettos on its islands, where the infected were kept apart. They were prisons of mercy, precursors to hospitals. Guards patrolled the shorelines, shouting at fishermen who strayed too close. Out of fear came the beginnings of discipline. The children's plague struck hard in northern France and England, its victims smaller and its grief sharper. Chroniclers noted that the disease moved faster but killed fewer. Perhaps it had changed, or perhaps the survivors had. Still, there were villages that disappeared between one harvest and the next. In Norfolk, monks recorded, "The young are cut down like grain in spring." Entire generations were lost before they could take root. Among the nobility, succession crises multiplied. Estates passed to infants or widows. Dynasties withered. The plague did what wars could not. It toppled lineages by neglect rather than defeat. In England, the royal household lost its heir, William of Windsor, a child of 5. The chroniclers wrote that the king wept as a common man. The event shook the illusion of divine favor more effectively than sermons ever could. The church, desperate to reassert control, turned to reform. Monastic orders admitted men once deemed unworthy. Merchants' sons, soldiers, widowers seeking penance. Parish priests were trained quickly, some scarcely literate, but willing to risk their lives for stipends and salvation. Piety hardened into routine. The great cathedrals echoed with fewer voices, but the candles still burned. In the towns, a new generation grew up surrounded by reminders of mortality. Painters covered chapel walls with frescoes of skeletons leading the living in an eternal dance. Merchants commissioned these works not from superstition, but from memory. A warning and a kind of pride that they had lived to pay for them. Even the laughter in taverns carried a hollow note, as if everyone drank with the same invisible guest. Scholars began to wonder whether this was the natural state of the world. At the universities of Paris and Prague, masters debated whether the pestilence arose from miasmas, corrupted stars, or humours within the body. Others spoke of contagion, an unseen poison passed by touch or breath. Arguments grew as fierce as battles, but the true enemy remained indifferent. In the meantime, the curriculum shifted. Medicine began to claim the authority once reserved for theology. For the common people, survival had become a trade. Women took on the work of men. Children learned to plough and weave. A household with 3 hands could manage the labour that once needed 10. The rhythm of life slowed but thickened, every act a small defiance. Across Europe, the few who endured became the rootstock of a changed humanity. Stronger, thriftier, less patient with miracles. By 1365, the second wave was fading. It had not ravaged as wide an area as before, yet its shadow lay long. The young were gone, leaving behind an older, more somber continent. Whole villages became settlements of widows and orphans. Historians would later call it a second pruning, the final cull before stability returned. In England, the loss of labour drove the crown to issue still harsher decrees. Men who left their masters were branded fugitives. Women who refused service were fined. The ink dried quickly on these edicts because there were too few clerks to enforce them. Power itself was thinning. Somewhere in Burgundy, a priest wrote in the margin of his missal, "The air smells different now." Perhaps he meant the decay of so many bodies. Or perhaps he sensed the subtler change, the beginning of skepticism, of inquiry, of the slow turning from prayer to observation. The plague had forced Europe to look inward, to dissect its own mortality. By 1369, the second wave was over. Bells rang again, timidly at first. Merchants opened their shops, mothers dared to bear children. Yet no one celebrated. The people had learned to mistrust reprieve. Life resumed not as resurrection, but as habit, a muscle remembered. What the pestilence had failed to kill outright, it had reshaped. Feudal bonds continued to loosen. Knowledge began to wander beyond the cloister. Governments recorded deaths and called it governance. Out of fear, something resembling reason was beginning to grow. With the air cleared and the cities repopulated, the ships set sail again. But behind every face that smiled at the returning sun lingered the same unspoken thought, that the shadow had merely stepped aside for a moment and would one day fall again. Long after the plague was gone, its voice still whispered through the land. What death had loosened, the living began to pull apart. The old hierarchies, lords, bishops, kings, still stood, yet their foundations had cracked like dry earth. A generation raised amid graves now came of age, and it did not inherit obedience. Across Europe, the survivors carried a new kind of hunger, not for bread or gold, but for reckoning. They had seen that the world could be remade overnight. Why then should it return to its former shape? In England, that question turned to fire. The crown's coffers were thin. War with France dragged on, and the plague had halved the taxpayers. When Parliament ordered a new poll tax in 1380, 3 groats per head, the same for pauper and noble alike. The resentment that had been ripening since the first mortality burst open. Preachers took up the grievance and gave it language. John Ball, a wandering priest, asked in the marketplaces, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" The words passed from village to village like a secret password. By the summer of 1381, England's south and east were moving. Labourers, artisans and apprentices, men who now knew their worth and refused to crawl, marched toward London under the leadership of Wat Tyler. They carried no banners of saints, only cudgels, and the conviction that the world had been tilted too long. When they entered the capital, they poured through the streets like floodwater, smashing the tax rolls and releasing prisoners. The young king, Richard II, barely 15, met them at Smithfield. His officers wavered, his knights hesitated. Tyler was struck down in the confusion, but his followers did not retreat. For a moment, London belonged to the commoners. It did not last. The rebellion was crushed within days, its leaders hunted and executed. Yet something irreversible had taken place. The peasants had learned that the might of the realm was only human, and that power could be spoken to, shouted at even. The monarchy learned too that its survival depended not on fear but on negotiation. Beneath the smoke of the executions, a modern politics was being born. On the continent, the same fever burned under other names. In France, the Jacquerie had erupted 3 decades earlier, in 1358, and its ashes still glowed. The peasants of the Ile-de-France and Picardy, crushed by taxes to fund the 100 Years' War, had risen with flails and sickles against their lords. They were slaughtered in the end, but the memory of defiance lingered. After the second plague, that memory turned practical. Farmers refused corvée labor, demanded wages, and migrated freely. The land no longer belonged only to those who claimed divine right. It belonged to those who could work it. In the towns of Flanders, where looms had gone still during the pestilence, a new class of artisans emerged from the void. Guilds swelled with men who owned no land but wielded skill. When their petitions for fair pay were ignored, they rose in 1379, seizing Ghent under the weaver Philip van Artevelde. For a year, the city ruled itself, a republic born of thread and stubbornness, until the French army crushed it at Rosebecque. The blood that soaked the fields was the price of an idea, that labor and dignity were the same word. Everywhere, authority shrank. The plague had not only killed men, but habits. Lords who survived found their tenants fewer and their purses lighter. To rebuild, they granted freedoms once unthinkable. Leases instead of servitude, wages instead of tithes. Each concession was a small revolution. The church, once the unshakable pillar, also trembled. Its priests had died by the tens of thousands, its reputation with them. Survivors had seen too many cowardly priests flee and too many charlatans thrive. A hunger for simpler faith spread across Europe. The sermons of Wycliffe in England, the Lollard heresy whispered in alehouses, the first stirrings of what would one day be reform. People began reading scripture in their own tongues. They no longer waited for permission to interpret the divine. In the universities, those fragile islands of learning that had barely survived the plague, new currents of thought took hold. Logic replaced dogma. Aristotle returned to his lecterns. Half the scholars who taught it were the sons of peasants who would once have been barred from such halls. Education, like labor, was changing hands. The arts turned from piety to protest. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote of merchants, millers, and clerks, giving speech to those who had none before. His pilgrims were not saints, but ordinary sinners, each carrying his own truth. The vernacular was no longer shameful. It was the new Latin of a divided world. In Italy, Boccaccio's Decameron had already shown how laughter could coexist with terror. Europe was learning to speak to itself again, not in prayer, but in story. Meanwhile, the economy shifted like soil after a flood. Fewer mouths meant richer meals for those left behind. Laborers demanded meat, not bread. Peasants bought land. Women inherited workshops. The shortage of hands elevated everyone who still had two. Markets widened as people moved freely from shire to shire, city to city. For the first time, mobility became a right rather than a risk. Governments tried to cage this restlessness. England renewed the Statute of Labourers. France created guild monopolies. The Empire imposed travel bans during outbreaks. But a population that had survived death was not easily frightened. Men who had once lived at their master's will now carried their own passports, crude letters of permission stamped with seals. The idea that movement might be recorded and controlled was new, proof that power was learning to adapt to a mobile world. Everywhere the smell of change clung to the air. The great landlords, their incomes shrinking, began leasing their estates. Villages merged, towns expanded, trade revived. The plague had been a scythe, and what followed was regrowth. Yet the new shoots were wild, untamed by the old hierarchy. For all the talk of reform, there was bitterness too. The young who had never known the first plague grew up under the shadow of the second. They had inherited a world full of bones and debts. Their laughter was edged with irony, their faith with doubt. Painters filled churches with images of death, leading the living in a grim dance. It was art as confession, beauty built from fear. Across Europe, officials worried about order, philosophers worried about meaning. What bound men together, if not shared suffering? The answer came slowly, in deeds rather than decrees. People began to trust contracts, not promises. Wages, not charity. Skill, not blood. The age of birthright was waning. In 1381, when Wat Tyler's rebels lay in their graves and the streets of London ran clean again, an observer wrote, "The commoners have returned to their ploughs, but not to their manners he was right. The ploughmen now looked their masters in the eye." The world had shifted a few inches closer to modernity. The great mortality had destroyed bodies. The decades that followed destroyed illusions. Out of both came a rough equality, born not from philosophy, but from exhaustion. When kings next raised armies, they would find fewer men willing to die for invisible crowns. When priests next promised heaven, they would find their listeners quieter, thinking of earthly bargains instead. By the mid-1380s, the uprisings had been suppressed, the sermons censored, the guilds pacified. But the seed had taken root. Europe had learned how to say no. And once spoken, that word does not die. Had Europe learned to live with its executioner, the plague no longer arrived as an apocalypse, but as a season. Its rhythm was almost familiar. Rumors in spring, death in summer, recovery in autumn. People called it the visitation, as if it were an old acquaintance who knocked every few years to be remembered. The air itself seemed to hold the memory of 1348. Whenever the weather turned foul, or the wind blew from the east, unease returned to the markets and monasteries. Rats appeared in the granaries, and mothers whispered prayers, while sealing their windows with waxed cloth. The difference now was habit. The first pestilence had taught panic. The later ones taught procedure. In Milan, the ruling Visconti had studied the advantage of isolation. The city's old policy of walling up infected houses had spared it once. Now it became law. Whole streets could vanish behind stone. Families entombed alive in their homes for the sake of the greater body. Outside the walls, soldiers guarded the roads, stopping travelers to demand proof of health. The documents they carried, letters bearing the city seal and a record of their last place of rest, were the ancestors of passports. Bureaucracy had found its purpose in fear. Venice, remembering the ruin of a century earlier, turned discipline into architecture. On the island of Santa Maria de Nazareth rose a permanent lazaretto, a quarantine station of wood and stone where travelers were held 40 days before entering the city. Ships arriving from Alexandria or the Levant were anchored in the lagoon, their cargoes aired, their crews watched by guards who counted the days aloud. Out of the stench of disease came an order almost monastic. Registers, inspections, seals, and reports. The Republic, always a merchant among moralists, treated contagion as it treated commerce, with ledgers and rules. Other cities followed. Florence appointed health officials, ufficiali di sanità, charged with tracking deaths, fumigating goods, and ordering burials beyond the walls. In Paris, the Parlement decreed that hospitals be divided into wards, one for the dying, one for the merely sick. Everywhere, plague was teaching government how to govern, yet no chart could map its path. Outbreaks flared without pattern. Vienna in 1399, Cologne in 1400, Lübeck in 1402, Paris again in 1407. Each year brought new names for the same disaster. The chroniclers wrote of a gentler pest, but it killed enough to make gentleness a cruel word. In England, entire villages recorded baptisms one year and burials the next, the ink smudged by damp fingers. Among physicians, learning advanced at the speed of loss. They observed that those who had survived one plague were less likely to perish in the next. Immunity had no name yet, but experience was making it visible. Doctors began to speak of the strong air, a resilience of the body rather than the stars. They still prescribed their ancient remedies, bloodletting, theriac, vinegar washes, but added new ones. Fumigations of sulfur, drinking of wine tempered with rosemary, avoidance of fear, which was thought to weaken the heart. The age of astrology was giving way to the age of experiment, though no one realized it yet. Meanwhile, the church, weary of endless funerals, learned restraint. Where once priests had led processions through crowded streets, now bishops forbade them. The papal bulls of the early 15th century praised prudence as the highest virtue. Stay indoors, keep silence, trust God, but keep distance. Faith had become practical. The arts reflected this discipline. In Florence, the fresco painters who had grown up in the shadow of the first plague now filled walls with images of order. Saints calm amid ruin, cities neatly enclosed, angels measured like geometry. Yet behind the calm, a new sensibility was forming. Human faces rendered with compassion, suffering not as punishment, but as fact. The Renaissance, often said to spring from rediscovered antiquity, also grew from the memory of disease. Economically, the continent was still reshaping itself. Labor remained scarce, wages high. Where nobles once ruled by inheritance, merchants now ruled by counting. Families like the Medici, the Fuggers, the Strozzi's built fortunes in banking and trade, their ledgers as holy as scripture. The pestilence had not only emptied lands, it had opened minds. Wealth became a matter of wit, not blood. The new prosperity was shadowed by fragility, every investment haunted by the question of how long its owner might live to enjoy it. The smaller outbreaks spared no class. In Paris, courtiers fled to the countryside. In Lübeck, merchants sealed themselves in their counting houses with enough food for 40 days. The poor remained, dying in the same streets where the rich had once traded. Death was no longer a marvel. It was a statistic. City notaries listed the dead by occupation, noting which trades vanished fastest: barbers, cobblers, fishmongers. To die had become an entry in a ledger. Despite the repetition, a strange confidence grew among the living. They had seen the plague return and retreat again. Each wave left survivors, and those survivors rebuilt faster. Houses rose on the foundations of others. Markets reopened. The air after every visitation smelled cleaner, as if the pest itself had scoured corruption from the world. Philosophers began to speak of cycles, of nature's purges and renewals. A fatalism both dark and hopeful took hold. Death as a gardener pruning excess, life as a plant that learned to bend. In that belief lay the seed of modern science. Observation replaced prophecy. Chroniclers began to compare cases, to measure intervals, to look for causes rather than curses. In Padua, a young physician named Michele Savonarola wrote that disease is born from matter, and matter may be altered by art. It was a sentence impossible before the plague. Still, the fear never left. The sight of a cart in the street, the sound of a cough behind a door, could unravel all the new logic. Mothers clutched their children. Sailors crossed themselves before touching a rope. And every spring, the same apprehension bloomed with the flowers. By 1420, Europe was older, richer, and haunted. The population had not yet returned to its pre-1348 size, but its spirit had changed. People no longer expected salvation. They expected recurrence. The pestilence had become part of time itself, a reminder that order is temporary. When the next wave came, they would be ready. Not with faith or hope, but with records, quarantine, and endurance. The Middle Ages were ending, though no one would know it for another century. The world was learning that survival, not certainty, was the measure of wisdom. And in the ports of Italy, where officials watched the horizon for incoming sails, a new understanding took shape. That the sea brought both death and fortune, and that civilization must learn to live with both, forever balancing one against the other. The story of the Black Death had been told in the tongues of Europe, but its reach had never stopped at the Alps or the Channel. The same wind that had carried the pestilence westward now circled back, crossing the mountains and deserts of Asia, following the trade routes that had first given it birth. The plague was not European. It was global before that word existed. In the 1350s, caravans once again threaded the old Silk Road. The steppe had quieted after the Mongols, but its merchants remained. Tatars, Persians, Chinese, Turks. They drove their camels through half-ruined caravanserais, carrying silk, paper, and iron, and unknowingly, the remnants of the contagion that had changed the world. Along the river valleys of Transoxiana and the oases of Samarkand, the sickness reappeared like an echo. In some years, it killed a village and vanished. In others, it swept through an entire province. The heirs of the Mongol Khanates had no empire left to command, only roots to protect. Yet those roots were the veins of life for the cities that remained. The plague flowed through them as easily as coin. Traders traveling between Tabriz and Herat spoke of the returning fever, of caravans found abandoned, of towns where the dogs barked all night, but no human voice answered. The Silk Road, once the artery of connection, became again the road of contagion. In Persia, the Ilkhanate had already collapsed, and local dynasties fought over its ashes. Drought and famine deepened the ruin. Plague was merely the final argument. Shiraz, Isfahan, and Rey lost half their people. Chroniclers wrote of houses without doors, streets without sound. In the eastern mountains, Sufi mystics preached that God had turned the world upside down to shake out its pride. Pilgrims gathered at shrines and carried the disease home in the name of piety. Farther south, India lay on the edge of that trembling world. The Delhi Sultanate, already weakened by invasion and revolt, began to record waves of pestilence in the 1360s and 1370s. Persian scribes at the Sultan's court described a disease that killed quickly and without mercy. It was not the first plague India had known, nor the last, but its reach was new. Grain markets closed, temples and mosques alike emptied. Farmers fled their fields, leaving rice to rot in the paddies. The empire that had seemed immovable flickered like a lantern in wind. The same trade that connected India to Arabia became a bridge for infection. Ships leaving the ports of Gujarat and Cambay carried spices and silks, and the fleas nesting in their cargo. They sailed west across the Arabian Sea to Aden and the Red Sea, to the harbours of Egypt and the Horn of Africa. Each voyage was a gamble between profit and death. In Yemen, travellers spoke of a fever from the sea. The port of Aden, once the meeting place of 3 continents, was struck repeatedly. The plague climbed from the coast into the highlands, where it killed the shepherds and their flocks together. The road to Mecca, that annual artery of pilgrimage, became another path of contagion. On the far side of the Red Sea, Ethiopia recorded its own devastation. In the royal chronicles of Emperor Amda Seon's heirs, there are sudden gaps, years with no entries, as if the scribes had simply laid down their pens. Church traditions remembered the years of darkness, when monasteries lost their monks and villages turned to silence. The Ethiopian highlands, usually spared from coastal diseases, could not resist this one. Traders blamed the ships from Egypt. Priests blamed the sins of kings. From Egypt, the plague spread south and west through the Maghreb, riding with the caravans that crossed the Sahara. Gold, salt, and death traveled together. The desert's emptiness slowed the pest, but it did not stop it. The oasis towns, Siwa, Gadams, Timbuktu, served as stations of both trade and infection. Chroniclers in North Africa wrote of caravans reduced to skeletons on the sand, their camels wandering loose. In the great city of Tunis, the chronicler Ibn Khaldun saw the ruin firsthand and gave it words that outlived his age. Civilization, both in the east and the west, was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish. It swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out. To him, the plague was not only a disease, but a turning of history's wheel, the end of an old cycle, and the beginning of a new, harsher one. From North Africa, the sickness passed down the trade routes into the sub-Saharan kingdoms. The gold cities of the western Sahel, Mali, Gao, Walata, had grown rich on the exchange of metal for salt and cloth. When the plague entered their markets in the late 14th century, it struck without warning. Arab travelers wrote of Black Death among the blacks, of whole caravans lost before reaching the Niger. The empire of Mali endured, but its merchants whispered that Allah had cursed prosperity itself. Along the Indian Ocean, the same ships that linked Africa to Arabia and India carried the contagion farther. Records from Chinese ports mention quarantines on foreign vessels, especially those from the West. The world's oceans, once the walls between civilizations, had become highways of transmission. Climate, too, played its part. The mid-14th century brought strange seasons, monsoons that failed, floods that followed drought. Famine opened the door that plague needed. In Asia and Africa alike, hunger and sickness were no longer separate chapters, but verses of the same poem. Yet everywhere it went, the plague changed shape, as if learning from each people it encountered. In Europe, it had been a fever of cities. In Africa, it became a hunger of villages. In Asia, it was a companion of dust and war. The same invisible enemy wore different masks, but spoke the same final language. Despite the ruin, trade endured. The merchants of Cairo still sent their ships to India. Caravans still crossed the desert. People had learned that profit, like plague, was unstoppable. They built rituals around their fear. Fumigations of aloes in Aden, processions in Delhi, prayers on the docks of Zanzibar. The more the disease returned, the more they treated it as a fact of nature, a tide to endure rather than to oppose. By the early 15th century, the plague's reach had stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Baltic to the equator. It had erased borders more effectively than any empire. Populations began to recover unevenly, North Africa slowly, India more swiftly, Central Asia scarcely at all. Many of the great Silk Road cities, hollowed out by death, never regained their voices. Trade shifted south toward the seas, where new empires would soon rise on the backs of sailors instead of caravans. In this long arc of destruction, one truth endured. The world was connected. Disease had proven it more decisively than commerce ever could. The generation that survived carried in its blood a memory it did not yet understand. Some lines of humanity had acquired resistance, others had perished entirely. The future would inherit both the strength and the emptiness. When the chroniclers of Europe wrote of their continent's suffering, they did not know that half a world away, other pens had fallen silent over the same grief. The plague had been everyone's story, written in every tongue, erased by the same hand. As the winds of the Indian Ocean shifted toward the west, merchants once again lifted their sails. The seas would bring new goods, new faiths, and soon new diseases, but none would ever again strike with the unity of that first darkness. The world had survived, but it had also been joined. Morning light returned to Europe with a different color. It seemed thinner, cautious, as if the sun itself were unsure of its welcome. The great dying had receded, yet its ghost lingered in the habits of the living. Every street, every trade, every prayer still bore its trace. People had learned to survive, but not yet to forget. Cities once gutted by silence were rising again. Florence counted the sound of chisels in its streets. The clang of workshops replaced the toll of funeral bells. Stone dust, not ash, hung in the air. Builders who had once dug graves now raised domes. Venice reopened its docks, Genoa its counting houses, Bruges its markets. Across the continent, towns swollen with widows and orphans filled slowly with laughter again. The wary laughter of those who knew what it had cost to be alive. Repopulation began not with abundance, but with patience. Families were smaller, streets wider, houses airier. Wells were covered, refuse carried outside the walls. The architecture of survival became the architecture of beauty. In Italy, city planners opened spaces for air and light, convinced that the sky itself could be medicine. Florence, scarred by its own losses, crowned its skyline with Brunelleschi's dome, a gesture of confidence so vast it seemed a defiance of death. Art followed the same impulse. The frescoes painted in these years, Masaccio's solemn saints, Piero's cool geometries, spoke of order after chaos. Bodies were drawn solid again, as if faith had returned to flesh. Beneath the calm faces of their Madonnas lay the memory of the plague pits. Artists no longer painted swarming heavens. They painted people, measured and human, their sorrow contained in symmetry. Religion, too, was learning a quieter voice. The church had survived, but diminished. Where once priests had thundered about wrath, they now murmured of mercy. New brotherhoods of laity spread through the cities, confraternities that fed the poor, buried the dead, and maintained hospitals. These were institutions of memory disguised as charity, built to ensure that the next time death came, it would find humanity more prepared. Medicine itself had changed. The physicians who had watched a century of pestilence learned to observe rather than to bless. In the schools of Padua and Bologna, students dissected human bodies under the supervision of grey-haired doctors who had seen too much to believe in invisible vapors. The miasma theory persisted, but it was being questioned. Men began to map the body like territory, to imagine its workings in terms of cause and consequence. Such curiosity was not faithless. It was faith redirected from divine will to divine design. The God of the 15th century seemed more like a craftsman than a judge, and the men who studied his creation were apprentices, not supplicants. This subtle shift, born of centuries of terror, would prove more transformative than the plague itself. In the countryside, the land had recovered faster than the people. Abandoned fields were reclaimed, but not as they had been. Grain had given way to pasture. Sheep dotted the hills where wheat once grew. The wool trade became Europe's new wealth, spinning cloth from death's leavings. In England, the green expanse of pastures turned the nation into a merchant's paradise. The same emptiness that had once marked loss became the foundation of prosperity. Economies grew leaner, more flexible. Labor was mobile, wages negotiable. Cities learned to pay for cleanliness and order. Taxes funded hospitals, bridges, and the care of orphans. The lessons of contagion became civic policy. The idea that health was a public duty, a government's business, had been born in the counting houses of plague time. Meanwhile, thinkers across the continent were rediscovering old books and new confidence. Petrarch had mourned the end of Rome's greatness. Now his disciples sought to revive it. Humanism spread through universities and courts, offering an antidote to despair. The human body, once seen only as a vessel of sin, became the subject of study and admiration. If the plague had proved the fragility of flesh, the Renaissance made beauty out of that very fragility. Even the sciences of the stars changed. Astrologers had blamed the conjunction of planets for the first mortality, but the 15th century looked upward with new purpose. Astronomy began to separate itself from superstition. The sky was no longer a moral theatre. It was a system to be measured. The same impulse that had once tallied deaths was now counting stars. Politically, Europe was knitting itself together out of necessity. The great mortality had forced princes to organize what chance had unraveled. City-states developed bureaucracies to manage public works, collect taxes, and record births and deaths. From these ledgers came a new vision of the state, not as divine inheritance, but as human construction. Survival required administration, and administration required memory. In that sense, the plague had invented modernity. The survivors themselves carried its imprint in their behavior. They washed more, traveled cautiously, distrusted crowds. Quarantine became habit. When a stranger arrived at the gate, his origin mattered more than his faith. A new geography of suspicion was forming, one that would define diplomacy and trade alike. The world had grown smaller and more aware of its own boundaries. Yet beneath this discipline flickered an ache for joy. The survivors of catastrophe always dream of colour. The 15th century answered that hunger with pageantry, festivals, carnivals. Music played louder than before. In Florence, they built elaborate processions for St. John. In Nuremberg, craftsmen paraded their guild banners through streets that had once been morgues. Laughter returned, but it kept one eye open. Every generation carries its ghosts, and the Renaissance carried the plague within its splendor. Beneath the brilliance of fresco and marble lay a quiet realism, the knowledge that beauty was temporary, that life was short, that order could crumble overnight. The dance of death still traced its shadow along the walls of even the grandest churches. But where earlier artists had painted terror, their heirs painted acceptance. Mortality was no longer an interruption. It was part of the design. The rhythm of life had steadied. Populations grew again. Fields thickened with wheat, and ships crossed the seas in search of spices and silver. The Mediterranean, once a theatre of contagion, now glittered with sails of trade and ambition. The plague still visited occasionally, but it no longer defined the age. When chroniclers looked back at the century behind them, they described it as a long exhalation after the storm. They believed the darkness had finally spent itself. They were wrong, but their optimism built cities, financed voyages, and illuminated canvases. Their hope, misplaced or not, remade the world. The 15th century ended not in silence, but in expectation. Scholars copied ancient texts, navigators charted new seas, and physicians examined the living instead of fearing the dead. humanity had walked through fire and discovered curiosity on the other side. In every rebuilt square, every workshop humming with craft, every chapel lighted with oil, one truth remained, scarred but persistent, that even after the worst has come and gone, the hand still reaches for the chisel, the brush, the pen. Creation had survived destruction, and in doing so had learned its purpose. History rarely announces its turning points. It arrives as a change in the air, a new confidence in the step, a silence where once there was fear. By 1500, Europe had stopped looking backward. The generation that built cathedrals had given way to one that built ships. The horizon had become the next frontier, and the old world, the world that had been bled and chastened by plague, was receding behind the sails. London, Florence, and Venice stood reborn, their stones cleaned of soot, their streets widened for trade. The smell of death had faded to memory, replaced by the odor of ink and salt and gold. Printing presses thudded in every city, turning words into armies. Books, not bells, marked the hours now. Knowledge multiplied faster than contagion once had. The same curiosity that had dissected corpses in Padua now dissected the heavens. Yet even amid this clamor of renewal, the shadow of the great mortality lingered. Every ledger of birth and death, every law on cleanliness or quarantine, every city gate that recorded the names of travelers, all were its descendants. Bureaucracy, medicine, and modern conscience had been shaped by a century of sickness. The Renaissance was not a resurrection, but a mutation, grown from the bones of the plague years. Venice had turned survival into science. Its lazarettos stood permanent now, guarded by physicians in long robes who recorded every arrival from Alexandria or Ragusa. The 40-day isolation that had once been desperation was now method, written into the statutes of trade. When the fleets returned from the Levant, laden with pepper and silk, they waited offshore until the inspectors gave the signal. Health, at last, had become an institution. Florence bore its scars in beauty. The city's churches were frescoed with order and light, their geometry a prayer for permanence. In the workshops of Verrocchio and Ghirlandaio, apprentices like Leonardo learned to measure the world with an anatomist's precision. To draw a body accurately was to honor it, to reclaim, with line and pigment, what the plague had once destroyed. Knowledge of flesh had replaced fear of it. In England, the memory of pestilence shaped labor and law alike. The manorial system, fractured by death, had yielded to a restless middle class. Merchants funded voyages instead of cathedrals. Discovery had replaced devotion. The wool trade enriched ports once gutted by mortality. On the same docks where bodies had once been carted to pits, sailors now loaded provisions for the new world. Expansion had replaced quarantine. The rhythm of life itself had changed. Birth rates surged, families swelled. Europe's population climbed back to its 13th century height, though the people were different, healthier, more mobile, more literate. The sons of peasants became clerks. The daughters of artisans entered convents to paint or to write. Work was no longer inherited, it was chosen. The plague had broken the chain of necessity. Religion, still powerful, found itself questioned by minds it had taught to read. The printing press spread scripture as easily as rebellion. In Wittenberg, a young Augustinian friar named Martin Luther studied the writings of those who had lived through the great mortality and saw in them not terror but hypocrisy. A century of disaster had made Europe skeptical, and skepticism was now faith's twin. Beyond the churches, physicians continued their quiet revolution. They catalogued diseases, recorded symptoms, and compared notes from city to city. Hospitals were no longer places to die, but to be observed. The miasma of divine punishment gave way to the vocabulary of natural cause. A Venetian doctor could now speak to a Parisian one in the same clinical tongue. Out of shared calamity had come a shared language. The arts, too, bore the confidence of survival. Where the earlier Middle Ages had carved saints in stone, the Renaissance carved man. Michelangelo's David stood in Florence's square, naked and unashamed, every vein rendered with the care once reserved for relics. The statue's calm defiance was not just biblical, it was historical. It was Europe, staring back at its own mortality and choosing courage over repentance. Exploration became the new contagion. Ships from Lisbon and Seville pierced the edges of the known world, carrying with them the same dual cargo that had always moved through history: curiosity and death. The plague had taught humanity how quickly the world could change. Now it sought to change it deliberately. When sailors reached the coasts of Africa, India, and the Americas, they brought diseases far deadlier than they imagined. The cycle repeated itself on another continent. The great mortality had gone global again, under new flags. At home, the fear of plague never vanished entirely. Small outbreaks still appeared in London, Milan, and Paris, minor rehearsals for future disasters. But the people no longer panicked. They followed the ordinances. Fires were lit in the squares, houses sealed, cargo burned. Survival had become routine. The same discipline that had saved lives now governed the mind. Modern order, its lists, its timetables, its certainty, was the afterlife of panic. In music and poetry, mortality remained the great subject, though it had changed its costume. Where once composers had written dirges, now they wrote masses of thanksgiving. The Miserere gave way to the Gloria. Writers like Erasmus and More spoke of reform and conscience. Their wit was sharpened by centuries of suffering. Even laughter in this new world had depth. As the 16th century began, the medieval imagination, the one that had peopled every storm with angels and demons, was retreating. In its place came anatomy, perspective, measurement, and law. The mystery of death had not been solved, only made familiar. The old fear of divine punishment was replaced by a colder anxiety, the knowledge that human reason was now responsible for its own safety. When plague returned to London in 1518, the records show efficiency rather than despair. The sick were moved to pest houses. Doctors kept ledgers. Priests wrote reports. The city counted the dead and went on. Europe had grown used to endurance. It had discovered that to live was not to be spared, but to continue despite the tally. From that resilience rose the modern age. The catastrophe that had once threatened to end history had instead taught humanity how to record it, how to question it, how to build beyond it. Out of the emptiness of 1350 had come the fullness of 1500. Printing, discovery, anatomy, banking, bureaucracy, and art. The Middle Ages had died not in battle or revelation, but of infection, and the Renaissance was its heir. On the eve of the Reformation and the voyages of discovery, Europe stood at a strange equilibrium. The dead had become statistics, the living citizens. Faith had learned humility. Science had learned ambition. Both, in their way, owed tribute to the same teacher. In Florence, a few old men remembered the plague of their youth, the smell of lime pits, the muffled bells. They would point to the dome rising above the city and say that it was built by the sons of the survivors. "We have endured," one of them said, "and therefore we can imagine." The world that had once shrunk to the size of a single village now stretched to the edges of the globe. Death had given humanity its scale, and as the century turned, the survivors' descendants stepped into the modern age, carrying two inheritances: the memory of how fragile life could be, and the proof that it could begin again.